So this is the last week in this sermon series called Unbelievable Faith. It's about Elijah and Elisha kind of confronting unbelief. And it's a fascinating look. It's kind of a look at the kings, kind of first and second kings, kind of a look at that and seeing what's going on. And when we look back in history, when we look back at where we've been in this series, we saw that King Ahab came onto the scene, and kings described him as being terrible, worse than any other king that came before him, that he completely abandoned everything. And he married this woman named Jezebel, and together they ushered in a new revolution in Baal worship or Baal worship, and had Baal worship going everywhere. And when it seemed like God's kingdom, and especially in the northern kingdom, was at its worst, then suddenly God came and sent his prophet Elijah to them. And it's all these amazing, we looked at all these amazing stories about Elijah and everything he did, and it kind of culminates in what I called the Battle of Baal Bluff, which was Mount Carmel. And God and Yahweh kind of showed that he was more powerful than the gods of Baal, or the more powerful than the prophets of Baal, and Baal, man, Sudafed. And so he came and consumed the fire, right? He consumed the offering where Baal's prophets couldn't do anything at all. And it was this great victory for Elijah. And what was interesting, though, about that victory is that usually when you have like a good victory, like it's like, yeah, all right, you're usually like strutting and walking tall. It's like, I can do all things through the Lord who strengthens me. And you're just like, you're doing all these things, right? But that's not what Elijah did. He ended up running away, scared for his life, ran away all the way through the wilderness for 40 days. That sounds familiar. And ran all the way to Mount Sinai and went into a cave, right? And then God came to him, but God didn't come to him in winds or giant earthquakes or anything like that. God came to him in this still, small voice and asked him, why are you here, Elijah? Why are you here? And Elijah's like, I'm the only one left. I'm the only one that actually believes. And God tells him, stop being so prideful about it. There's 7,000 that are still faithful because I'm keeping them there. And he goes, and in case you doubt my power, there's an incredibly rich guy down there plowing his fields with a team of 12 oxen. Go ask that guy. By the way, his name is Elisha. Go ask him to follow you and Yahweh and see what happens. And Elisha follows him. And he leads him on, and then we get into Elisha's, Elijah ends up going up into the heavens on like chariots and all those things, and then we have Elisha. Now, here's the thing with Elisha's life. Some of you are like, we've only had like 2 weeks on Elisha. So Elisha is promised to have a double blessing of Elijah. Here's what that means in practice. Aside from the story of Naaman, which was my last sermon that I preached here, aside from that sermon, aside from that story, Elijah basically does everything that Elijah does just twice. So he gets like a double portion of it. So there's like a story of him with a widow and with a son and all these things. I encourage you to read it. It's 2 Kings 1 through 9. And today we're kind of at the end of Elisha's time. And we're looking at 2 Kings 9 through 10. And this story is kind of fascinating. We're kind of closing up the story and closing up everything that kind of goes around it. And it might go in places that you don't quite expect it to. So this is Elisha's final act. And one of his final acts is God comes up to him and says, hey, I need you to anoint a new king. There's this guy Jehu over there. This guy looks great. Go anoint him, and he will be extremely powerful. He'll be extremely powerful in all that he's doing. And so it says this, and this was read a little bit ago, but we'll read it again. 2 Kings 9, beginning with verse 6. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, to Jehu, I anoint you, through Elisha, I anoint you king over the people of the Lord, over Israel. And you shall strike down the house of Ahab, your master, so that I may avenge on Jezebel the blood of my servants the prophets, and the blood of all the servants of the Lord. For the whole house of Ahab shall perish, and I will cut off from Ahab every male, bond or free, in Israel. So this is pretty amazing, right? Like God sends Elisha to anoint Jehu to basically take care of business with Ahab, this wild, tyrannical king who's brought in Baal worship and all these other things. And Jehu ends up going on this big zealous rant. And it looks like he's going to finally get the job done. Finally, the king has been anointed by God's prophet, and he ends up taking care of business. He assassinates Ahab and his entire family. He ends up executing Jezebel so that she's literally eaten by the dogs, as prophesied by Elijah. If you didn't know any of this existed, you need to read 2 Kings 9 and 10 when you get home, all right? The story's craziness. It's wild. And so he's getting rid of everybody, right? And so he's getting rid of all the evil people, and he gets rid of all of Ahab's descendants. And after he does this, we get to 2 Kings chapter 10. So we were in chapter 9, we go all the way to 2 Kings 10. He's been on the warpath, and he invites a guy into his chariot with him, and he's like, Come with me and see my zeal for the Lord. And what he does then, in his zeal for the Lord, is he gathers together all the prophets of Baal or Baal in one place, and he kills them all. and he just obliterates them. Like he's the one, all was lost, and he has been anointed to restore the kingdom. Everyone knows me too well now, right? They're like, I don't think we should be celebrating. Like that's when we look out at the world today, though, we long for one to come and put things back into place. We see the world all around us rampant with sin, running amok. People just aren't caring about it. No one seems to be honoring God or putting them first in their lives. All of our politicians seem corrupt and self-serving. The state of human sexuality is a mess. Morality seems to be defined by whatever you feel like that day. Everyone seems to be yelling at each other, bearing false witness about each other. When we look at the 10 Commandments, I don't know if our world even knows how to keep a single one. And oftentimes we long for someone anointed from on high to come and finally make things right. You know, sometimes we say we need there to be a super pastor to preach and lead people much like Billy Graham. Perhaps his name will be Chris Escher, right? Sometimes if only we could lead into another spiritual revolution, we could finally get behind someone like that. Sometimes we feel like, it needs to be another king and president. Only that one will be able to save us if we finally get him into the office. Sometimes we think that we need to do whatever we can to get the right justices on the Supreme Court. But we long for the day when the anointed one for the Lord will come and set and make everything right. Finally, the one from the Lord has come, right? It looks like in our story today, it looks like Elisha has done that he's appointed this great king, King Jehu, who says that he's even zealous for the Lord. Now, all right, I got to be honest with you. A year ago, maybe 2 years ago, I would have been blasted by this. Come see with me my zeal for the Lord. And I wouldn't have thought about it. I'm like, okay, yeah, the guy's like into the Lord, you know, like all those things. But something happened to me. I preached an entire series on Acts. Many of you were here for that because it was last summer. And in that, I began to see a different thread about zeal. And I went, oh. Because in that, I saw that I think Acts is leading us into moving from zeal to contentment. Because Paul was zealous for the Lord, and he broke every commandment to keep his word to the Lord. Right? He was killing people. He was hurting people. He was all that. And we end up seeing that he moves to contentment. Right? He even says it. He says, like, brothers, I was a Hebrew of Hebrews. There was no better Pharisee of me, and I was zealous, and I persecuted the church. And he ends up saying in letters written from prison, neither height nor depth nor angels or demons, nor things present, nor things to come, nor things in the past, principalities, everything in danger could ever separate us from the love of God. And I preached that sermon series, and all of a sudden I began to look at zeal differently. See, I'm zealous for a clear voice. But it's just not given to me lately. But I saw that in Acts, and then so when we're preparing for this sermon, I come across here in this anointed king who's doing all these acts of violence, which God said, hey, go take care of Ahab through the prophet Elisha. He goes, go take care of Ahab, but he starts doing more than that. Right? He grabs this guy and goes, come and get in the chariot with me, and you can watch my zeal for the Lord. And he goes and he kills all these prophets of Baal. And then this happens. And this is 2 Kings chapter 10, verse 29. Like 10 verses after that zealous comment. But Jehu did not turn aside from the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin, that is, the golden calves that were in Bethel and Dan. But Jehu was not careful to walk in the law of the Lord, the God of Israel, with all of his heart. He did not turn from the sins of Jeroboam, which he made Israel to sin. In those days, the Lord began to cut off parts of Israel. He was the anointed king of Israel, sent with all the power and the glory to finally come and fix it. But in those days, Israel began to be cut off. That's hard. That's a hard lesson. He fails. He still bows down to the golden calves, which has a ton of Exodus overtones if you missed it. Right? He says, look at my zeal for the Lord, as he goes and takes care of all those Baal worshipers. But his zeal didn't go much farther past that, did it? Maybe his zeal wasn't for the Lord. Maybe it was for power. I don't know what it was. But he fails and he still worships those golden calves. Even the great Jehu is corrupt, and God allows his people to begin to be taken over. Even this great king anointed by God can't fix things. And his sin gets in the way. So this sermon is all about hope, right? I like it when people get the jokes like that. I think that we see ourselves in this so much, where we long for someone powerful and great to come. And we read stories like this, and we're like, well, this is kind of a downer. Like, man, if I knew Sunday was going to be this downer and it's beautiful outside, I would have gone and, I don't know, fished somewhere illegally or something like that. It's illegal to fish in the pond over here. So it's kind of a deep cut for those of you. We kind of like, and it leaves us asking, it's like, well, where do we go from here? Because this is kind of the end of the story. It's kind of the end of the story. And I think what's interesting about this area of Kings is what it's asking us to look at. Because I don't think it's asking us to look at Jehu and his awesome power and his authority that he had over that. I think it's asking us to look for something else, because it's asking us, it's like, don't you see what's happening? They are in captivity. Like, they're not much after this. The nation of Israel and Judah, the southern kingdom, are taken in as slaves into Babylon. Like, they're utterly destroyed and everything is taken from them. And Kings knows that that's coming up here. And it's asking us to look at something, and I think it's what it's asking us for. It's not for us to look at the power of Jehu, but instead it's asking us to listen to the still small voice that talks to Elijah in the midst of the cave. That's telling Elijah, no. There's still 7,000 that are still righteous. Elijah. It's asking us to look for the mustard seeds. Because when we look at the history of God's people, God never works through like those big, huge things. I mean, think about it. A man with a speech impediment told Pharaoh to let my people go. A king who was too small and was easily overlooked was the one that was described as being God after God's own heart. It's David. And the prophet who was incredibly rich gave it all up to become poor to follow after God's own way. That's Elisha himself. And God himself did not see the need to flaunt his power, but instead came as one of us and took on the very nature of a servant, lowering himself all the way down to the point of death, even death on a cross. And at that lowness has caused all nations, even the entire cosmos, to cry out that there is no other name besides Jesus. God always seems to work through the small things, through the broken things. So Christians in the room today, and anyone else that's listening, stop going after the power of the world. Stop going after all the great things. Just stop. Stop looking for the one anointed that's finally going to come save us, because our victory is already won in Jesus. Stop trying to save yourself to be your own salvation, where you can trying to save yourself if I can just get into the right relationship, if I can just get to the right doctor, if I can get the right medication, if we can finally catch this one last thing, then I will finally be saved and be able to live more. Stop looking to try to fix every one of your nieces, nephews, daughters, sons, parents. Stop trying to fix them. You're not going to find salvation in that. Stop. God is in control. I'm saying this because it kind of reminded me, I was talking to a lady, it's so cliche, I was talking to a lady on an airplane. But I was talking to her, and she was really worried about her niece and some of the choices that her niece was making. And I don't know why I was talking to her about this, but I think it has to do with today too. I ended up telling her, I'm like, you don't have to fix your niece. The only thing you have to do with your niece is to love her. You don't have to fix her. And that's hard for us to hear sometimes. We're like, no, they're making bad decisions. You don't have to fix your niece. Like we look at Jehu, and sometimes we feel like, oh, I need to be a Jehu. Just anoint me, God, and I will strike vengeance into the heart of my enemies. But in Jehu's lifetime, God began to cut it off. Right? Like that's a weird thing for us to see. So God's in control. Here at the book of at the end of the book of Kings. It's 1st and 2nd Kings. It was too long to be one scroll. That's why we have 1st and 2nd Kings. Everything has failed. Everything has fallen at the end. Like, everything is just fallen apart now. And they're going into Babylon, and they're losing their very identity as they're becoming Babylonians, the people of God. And for those of you that were here on the first Sunday that we started this sermon series, I asked you something, and I wanted you to watch for something. And I'm going to remind you of what that was. I wanted you to watch, in all the powerful things that Elijah and Elisha did, I want you to look for this one simple question. Did it solve anything? They're super cool stories. And it's amazing to see God working in that circumstance, but did it keep them out of Babylon? Did it solve anything? Because we're at the end, and they're going into Babylon. But I want to show you something. And it's really interesting. Because when you fast forward all the way to the end of 2 Kings, you end up seeing something kind of interesting. Right at the end, it's almost hidden. And for years and years and years, I didn't have eyes to see this. I didn't have eyes to see. I didn't have ears to hear this and all that. And I would just blaze by this. It's just one little paragraph right at the very end of 2 Kings chapter 25. But for some reason, I see it now. And there's a glimmer of hope at the end. When the northern kingdom, led by Jehu, all falls apart and is taken into Babylon. And now the southern kingdom, the righteous ones, are also taken into Babylon. Suddenly we get to 2 Kings, right at the end. It's not chapter 10, it's chapter 25. But it says this. It says, evil Merodach, that's a terrible translation. Evil is good, but this is the king of Babylon's name. He's named after Babylon's god of war and death. Okay? That's who this guy is. Balaam Marduk is his name. And so evil Marduk, king, the god of Babylon over death and warfare, king of Babylon, in the year that he began to reign, graciously freed Jehoiakim, king of Judah, from prison. And he spoke kindly to him and gave him a seat above all the seats of the kings who were with him in Babylon. Do you see the hope there? Because look at it. This evil king named after the terrible god of war and death in Babylon, for some reason, God ordained, right? He raises the king of Judah, the king over God's people, and sustains the people of God. And what we end up seeing is because of that action, even through that evil king, we end up getting the line that is preserved, the kingdom of God that is preserved, that we end up coming through even to Jesus. And Jesus came and through that line, and he saves us all. Because think about what it meant for Jesus to die. It meant that, looks like this king here, it's king of Babylon, the kings of Rome, all evil. It looks like it won. And I'm sure evil was doing a little jig or dance or something. I can't dance. And he did a little dance, but that's when evil looked like it won. In the Gospel of Matthew, it says that earthquakes shattered all over the earth, and the curtain in the temple torn in two, and dead bodies came alive from the graves and wandered around saying hello to people. Like, it's all kinds of weird stuff because it was an earth-shattering experience that brought hope to all of us who have ever been crushed by sin, despair, and that God works even through that. That God preserves us, even in the hurt and the pain. That God even works through it. And I think that's amazing that at the end of this book, when all things have just gone under and become disrepaired, it's almost like the Gospel of Matthew plays homage to this verse. Because all of Rome personified by one Roman centurion, after seeing Jesus die and everything happens around it, he says, truly this man was the Son of God. So rest, church. Rest. It'll be all right. The Lord is preserving his church, and he's preserving you. And that's good news. And let's tell the world about it. We'll end right there.